History is not written with ink by gentle hands. It is hewn by swords from the bones of empires, soaked in the blood of the bold, and whispered in eerie legends long after the throne room falls silent. In the barbaric twilight of Rome's fall, one dynasty rose like a dark star, a line of warrior kings shrouded in myth and magic. They were the Merovingians, the so-called Sorcerer Kings, rulers of the Franks. Their story is a cacophony of violence and prophecy, of queens wielding daggers behind silken veils, of long-haired monarchs who claimed divine blood yet became puppets of their own servants. Few dynasties have been born in such mystery, or died in such bitter irony. They carved a kingdom from the corpse of Roman Gaul and forged an alliance with the Church, only to be betrayed by their own legend, the very mythic aura that once set them apart. Imagine a family at the edge of the world's end, a founder sired by a creature from the sea, straddling the line between man and monster, whose blood would spark a royal line. A king, his son, burying golden treasures with him as if to cheat oblivion. A conqueror, the grandson, uniting a people under one faith with the slashing sword in one hand and the holy cross in the other. Then, generations of heirs, some ferocious, some foolish, some said to cure by touch and foresee the future. And among them, two rival queens, as ruthless as any king, who would turn brother against brother in a war of poisoned knives and shattered oaths. Finally, a line of phantom kings, crowned in ceremony but emptied of power, their sacred long hair the only remaining crown, while real authority passed to the shadows. This is no fairy tale. This is a 250-year saga of the Merovingians, a dynasty that began in myth and ended in abasement. Our journey today is a treasure hunt, seeking the answer to a single burning question. How did a dynasty born in myth become enslaved by its own legends? To find that answer, we must step back into the mists of the 5th century, to the dying days of Roman power and the birth of a legend, to a seashore at twilight, where a Frankish queen encountered a beast from the deep. In that moment, history and myth collided, giving us the dynasty's enigmatic progenitor. His name was Merovech, and his birth was the first whisper that the Merovingians were not like other men. Mid-5th century, the Roman Empire is crumbling in the west. Gaul, the province that will one day be France, is a patchwork of warlords and fading imperial governors. Along the North Sea coast, the Frankish tribes are rising. One Frankish leader, King Clodio, pushes south from his stronghold beyond the Rhine, testing the weakened Roman defenses. But our tale focuses not on Clodio's battles, but on his wife and the uncanny child she bore. The Chronicle of Fredegar, written long after but echoing older whispers, tells us that Queen Clodia, Clodio's wife, went to bathe in the sea one bright summer noon. There in the sun-dappled waves, something found her, a hulking creature of the ocean, a beast of Neptune, in the chronicler's words, half bull and half sea monster, known as the Quinator. What happened in those waves is lost to time, but the legend is shockingly clear. The queen emerged pregnant, perhaps by her husband Clodio, or perhaps by that otherworldly beast. In due course, she gave birth to a son, Merovech. From this murky parentage sprang the name Merovingian, the sons of Merovech, a line touched by something beyond mortal. If his father was the sea beast, Merovech carried otherworldly blood in his veins. If his father was Clodio, then he was of noble Frankish stock. The legend leaves it enticingly unclear, as if even then people since the Merovingians walked in two worlds, the brutal real and the supernatural. Later ages would nickname them the long-haired Sorcerer Kings. They never claimed to be gods. Unlike the Romans, or even some Germanic kin, they didn't officially insist they descended from Wotan or Mars. Yet, through whispers and folklore, the idea took root that the Merovingian kings had a sacral aura. They let their hair grow long from Merovech's time onward, a flowing mane that set them apart from ordinary Franks with cropped locks. The people believed these locks held magic. To cut a Merovingian's hair was to strip away his power. And so, the kings of Merovech's blood never cut their hair, and in that hair lived the mystique of a sacred king. But myth alone doesn't win thrones. Merovech, for 150s AD, whether man or demigod, he led the Franks in a brutal age. Roman chronicles fade here, but it said Merovech fought at the Battle of Chalons in 451, where Romans and barbarians together turned back Attila the Hun. Perhaps he was there, a young Frankish warlord under Roman banners, drenched in Hunnic blood on the Catalonian fields. Perhaps not. In legend he stands as a bridge between Rome and barbarian, between myth and reality. He died around the year 457, leaving a young son to carry on his line. That son would transform the Franks from foederati, allies of Rome, into masters of Gaul. His name was Childeric. Childeric I, son of Merovech, came of age as the Roman Empire's sun was finally setting in the west. Gaul was up for grabs, and Childeric, king of the Salian Franks, meant to take his share. He was a clever, fierce man, but also flamboyant in the old Frankish way. We're told he wore a purple cloak and long hair plaited with gold threads, a barbarian king with a taste for Roman pomp. Yet early in his reign, his people turned against him. One chronicle hints at scandal. Childeric had a weakness for the daughters of his subjects. Perhaps one too many fathers and husbands were cuckolded, and the tribe revolted. Childeric was driven into exile, forced to flee his own realm under pain of death. He sought refuge among allies far to the east, at the court of the king of Thuringia. For 8 years, Childeric waited in exile, a king without a throne. But he had left behind a trusted friend with a secret sign, a split coin, half kept by Childeric, half by the friend. When the time was right, when the Franks' anger had cooled and they needed their king again, the friend would send Childeric's half of the coin back to him, a token to return. And so it happened. Years later, Childeric slipped back into Frankland, coin matched with coin, and his people welcomed him once more as king. Even in disgrace, he was calculating. He turned exile into an opportunity, even stealing away the wife of his host. Legend says Queen Baina of Thuringia left her husband to join Childeric, saying, "I know your worth. You are the strongest man in the world. That is why I came to you." It was a union of ambition and desire. Baina became Childeric's queen, and soon the mother of a son who would eclipse them all, Clovis. When Childeric died in 481, he was buried as befitted a Merovingian sorcerer king. In Tournai, his grave was filled with treasures, weapons and jewelry, his golden-fringed cloak, and most curiously, hundreds of tiny golden bees. These bees, finely crafted ornaments, were scattered around him like a swarm frozen in gold. Perhaps they symbolized immortality and resurrection, ancient emblems of a soul that would rise again. Over a millennium later, when this tomb was unearthed, those golden bees would astonish France and become a symbol for a new emperor. Napoleon would claim them as his emblem of power, reaching back to the first kings of the Franks. It was as if Childeric's memory carried a hidden sting, an echo of the past that would never truly die. But the greatest treasure Childeric left was his 15-year-old son, Clovis, and the future of the Frankish people resting on his young shoulders. Clovis I, the name would be remembered as the first great king of France. Clovis, evolved from Clodovec, would echo through history as Louis, born by dozens of later French kings. But in 481, Clovis was just a teenage warlord with a restless kingdom to lead. He inherited his father's royal blood and commanding presence, but he also inherited a fractured landscape. Northern Gaul was still partly Roman. A Roman general, Syagrius, held sway in Soissons, ruling a rump state cut off from the dying empire. To the south, powerful barbarian kingdoms sprawled. The Visigoths in Aquitaine, the Burgundians in the Rhone Valley, the Alemanni in the east. If Clovis was to be more than a minor king, he had to crush these rivals one by one. And he wasted no time. At Soissons in 486, Clovis confronted Syagrius, the last Roman in Gaul. The two armies met, and the young Frankish king obliterated the Roman force. Syagrius fled to the Visigothic court, but Clovis coldly demanded his surrender, and the Visigoth king, eager to appease this rising star, handed Syagrius over. Clovis summarily executed the Roman Gaul was no more. The name Gaul itself began to fade. As Clovis's Franks took control, the land would come to be known by a new name, Francia. Clovis was a new kind of conqueror, a barbarian chief who understood both force and finesse. One famous story from this conquest shows the blend of brutality and cunning that defined him, the episode of the Soissons vase. After battle, Clovis's troops gathered treasure, including a precious ornate vase claimed from a church. Clovis wanted this fine vase returned intact to the bishop, or perhaps for himself, as a gesture of goodwill or personal admiration. But the Frankish custom was to share spoils equally. When Clovis asked for this special piece out of turn, one of his Frankish warriors protested. In fact, he smashed the vase with his axe, shattering it, sneering that Clovis would get only the shard due to him by lot. The king held his fury in check and did not retaliate in the moment. He took some fragments as his share and said no more. But a year later, during a routine weapons inspection, Clovis came to that same soldier. Finding a flaw in the man's axe, Clovis threw it to the ground. As the soldier bent to pick it up, Clovis swung his own axe down and split the man's skull. Thus, Clovis said coldly, "Did you to the vase at Soissons." The sudden execution shocked all, a clear message that Clovis suffered no insult unpunished, and that he possessed a long memory and longer reach. The story may be apocryphal, but it captures the calculating violence of Clovis's rule. He would use piety or murder as it suited, and sometimes both in tandem. By 496, Clovis had expanded Frankish rule over much of northern and eastern Gaul. Yet, a crucial transformation was coming, not only for Clovis, but for the destiny of Europe. Clovis, like most Franks, was a pagan, worshipping the old Germanic gods. His wife, however, was not. Clotilda, a Burgundian princess he married, was a devout Catholic Christian. She pleaded with her husband to abandon his warlike gods and accept her God, the God of Nicene Christianity. Clovis listened politely but remained unconvinced until desperation forced his hand. In 496, the Franks fought for survival against the Alemanni, another Germanic tribe, at the Battle of Tolbiac. The battle went poorly. The Franks were faltering. As the story goes, with his warriors dying around him, Clovis raised his eyes to heaven. In a moment of crisis and epiphany, he prayed to Clotilda's God. "If you grant me victory," he vowed, "I will believe in you and be baptized in your name." Almost immediately, the tide of battle shifted. The Franks rallied, and the Alemanni were defeated, their kings killed or surrendering. Clovis kept his word. On Christmas Day, 508, some sources say 496. The dates vary in records, but the traditional tale fixes it on a Christmas. In the city of Reims, King Clovis was baptized into the Catholic faith. With him, thousands of his Frankish warriors accepted baptism. This was not a quiet affair, but a royal spectacle. The powerful Bishop Remigius presided. As Clovis stepped into the baptismal font, the old legend says a miracle occurred. They lacked holy chrism oil for the anointing, an important part of the sacrament. At that moment, a white dove descended from the sky, bearing a vial of holy oil from heaven. This holy ampulla was used to anoint Clovis on the spot, signifying that he was chosen not just by men, but by God. The crowd was awestruck. The symbolism was unmistakable. Clovis, once a pagan warlord, was now a new Constantine, a Christian emperor in all but name, ordained by divine will. The church embraced him eagerly. Here was a Catholic king among a sea of heretic, Arian, barbarian rulers. The Pope and bishops saw in Clovis a champion of orthodoxy who could bring the one true faith to all of Gaul. By accepting the Roman Church, Clovis gained something priceless: legitimacy and support from the Gallo-Roman populace and the clergy. In one stroke, he distinguished himself from rival kings like the Visigoths, who followed the Arian Christian sect shunned by Catholics. Clovis's conversion was a masterstroke of kingship. It bound his Frankish warriors to him by the shared camaraderie of baptism, and it won him the alliance of the Church, who now preached in favor of his rule. With God and the Church. On his side, Clovis went on to conquer the Visigothic kingdom of Toulouse, smashing them at the Battle of Veil in 507 and personally killing their king, Alaric II. He seized Aquitaine, pushing the Visigoths into Hispania. He subdued the Burgundians, at least for a time, and received the accolades of even the Eastern Roman Emperor, who granted Clovis an honorary title of consul, recognition that he was now the rightful master of Gaul. By the time of his death in 511, Clovis had united all the Franks and most of Gaul under his rule. From the North Sea to the Pyrenees, from Brittany to the Rhine, a new realm had emerged, the Frankish kingdom, with Clovis as its architect. It was the largest and most powerful state to rise in Western Europe since Rome's fall. Yet, the same Clovis who forged this kingdom also sowed the seeds of future strife. In true Frankish fashion, he treated his realm not as a single indivisible empire, but as family property to be divided among his heirs. Upon his death, his 4 adult sons split the kingdom, each taking a quarter like ravenous lions feasting on a great kill. The Merovingians believed in the unity of their bloodline, but not necessarily in the unity of the map. All Frankland was theirs collectively, but individual kings ruled from different cities: Paris, Orleans, Soissons, Reims, capitals of convenience. The result was an unstable quilt of kingdoms that could come together or fall apart as brothers quarreled or died. And Clovis's sons were as ruthless and ambitious as he had been. Almost immediately, they turned on each other and on their own kin. The Merovingian house, so fearsome against outsiders, had an old Achilles heel. They were incapable of peace among themselves for long. One particularly dark tale illustrates this brutal family dynamic. In 524, one of Clovis's sons, King Clodomir, was killed in battle against the Burgundians. He left behind 3 young sons, Clovis's grandsons, of royal blood. By custom, these boys had a claim to their father's share of the kingdom. But Clovis's surviving sons, their uncles, Clotaire and Childebert, saw an opportunity. They invited the young princes into their care, and then murdered 2 of them outright, stabbing the children to death to eliminate rivals. The 3rd boy, we are told, was saved at the last moment by intervention of clergy and sent to a monastery, his hair shorn, his claim nulled by tonsure. When their mother, Clotilda, Clovis's widow, demanded justice for her slain grandsons, she received none. The uncles had consolidated their power by spilling the blood of their brothers' children. This would not be the last time Merovingian royals shed the blood of kin. Indeed, the saga of the Merovingians would soon feature one of the most savage blood feuds in medieval history, a clash that spanned decades and claimed an astonishing toll: the feud of Queen Brunhild and Queen Fredegund, a story of 2 women and endless death. By the late 6th century, the Frankish realm was typically divided into 3 great subkingdoms: Neustria in the northwest, roughly northern Gaul; Austrasia in the northeast, the Rhineland and beyond; and Burgundy in the southeast. These were not separate countries, but domains ruled by different Merovingian kings of one family. In 561, Clovis's last surviving son, Clotaire I, died, and his 4 sons split the Frankish world yet again. It is here that 2 of those sons, Sigebert I of Austrasia and Chilperic I of Neustria, and their formidable wives come to the forefront. What followed between these royal houses makes Game of Thrones pale by comparison. Sigebert of Austrasia was a warrior king, stern and respected, ruling from the Rhineland. To cement an alliance and gain a cultured bride, Sigebert took as wife Brunhild, a princess of the Visigoths. Brunhild was not just any princess. She was intelligent, strong-willed, and refined, a woman of high education in an age when learning was rare even among men. When she arrived in Austrasia, she brought Roman glamour and Gothic pride, immediately raising the prestige of Sigebert's court. Sigebert's younger half-brother, Chilperic of Neustria, grew envious. Chilperic was a very different character, rash, greedy, with a cruel streak, and he had inherited the smallest portion of their father's lands. Desiring to match Sigebert's brilliant marriage, Chilperic asked for the hand of Brunhild's elder sister, Galswintha. Despite her father's misgivings, Chilperic's reputation preceded him. Galswintha married Chilperic and came north, bringing a rich dowry of cities. But the marriage was doomed. Chilperic was already entangled with a lover, a low-born but strikingly ambitious woman named Fredegund. Fredegund had begun as a palace servant, perhaps even a slave, but she had captured Chilperic's heart with her wiles. Soon after Galswintha arrived, jealousy and tension filled the palace. Galswintha, discovering Chilperic in bed with Fredegund, threatened to leave him. Then, one morning, the court of Neustria awoke to shock. Queen Galswintha was found strangled to death in her bed. The new king, Chilperic, shed some tears for form's sake, and within days, he married Fredegund, elevating his mistress to queen. The news of Galswintha's murder raced across the Frankish realms. In Austrasia, Queen Brunhild's sorrow blazed into fury. Her beloved sister had been killed, almost certainly at the orders of Chilperic and Fredegund. Brunhild demanded vengeance. Her husband King Sigebert was all too willing to oblige. A blood feud erupted. Austrasia versus Neustria, brother against brother, queen against queen. The Franks had warred among themselves before, but never with such personal hatred at the core. Sigebert marched west, defeating Chilperic's forces in battle after battle. The Austrasian king proved himself a formidable general, pushing Chilperic to the brink. By 575, Chilperic's army was shattered, his cities falling one by one. Sigebert captured Chilperic's capital. The Neustrian magnates, fed up with their king, began to acclaim Sigebert as king of Neustria as well. It seemed Brunhild would have her justice and Sigebert would reunite the Frankish kingdoms under his own crown. But Fredegund was not finished. As Chilperic cowered in defeat, Fredegund hatched a desperate and dastardly plan. She dispatched assassins, 2 loyal men, with concealed long knives coated in poison. Disguised as petitioners, these men approached Sigebert's camp at Vitry, where celebrations were underway for his victory. Under the guise of delivering a message, they came close to King Sigebert and stabbed him mercilessly with their poisoned blades. The great king collapsed, his body burning from venom and wounds. Sigebert I, victorious in war, fell to murder at the moment of his triumph. Fredegund's agents had turned the tide in an instant. With Sigebert dead, Brunhild's fortunes plummeted. The Austrasian army, leaderless and far from home, dissipated in panic. Chilperic, suddenly saved from annihilation, swiftly reclaimed his realm. The widowed Brunhild fell into the hands of Chilperic, her hated brother-in-law. He humiliated the captured queen by parading her in chains. According to one report, Fredegund herself slapped Brunhild and tore out chunks of her hair, the slave queen reveling in the defeat of the princess. Yet Brunhild's story did not end in captivity. She was too valuable, as the mother of Sigebert's heir. Austrasian nobles soon ransomed or rescued her. Some accounts say Merovech, Chilperic's own son from a prior marriage, took pity on Brunhild and briefly even married her in defiance of his father. A bizarre twist which infuriated Fredegund and likely led to Merovech's early demise. In any case, Brunhild escaped back to Austrasia to continue the fight as regent for her young son. The feud entered a new phase, a cold war of intrigue and occasional battles stretching for decades. On one side was Queen Brunhild of Austrasia, a widow and mother, striving to protect her husband's legacy and groom her sons and grandsons into kings capable of avenging their kin. On the other side, Queen Fredegund of Neustria, now firmly the wife of King Chilperic and later regent for her own son. Fredegund's cruelty became legendary. She was said to have ordered the assassination of tenacious enemies, and even attempted to murder her own daughter when the girl fell ill, blaming sorcery. She sent hitmen to try to kill Brunhild multiple times. She even hired a killer to fling an axe at King Childebert II, Brunhild's son. The attempt failed, the axe striking the boy's tutor instead. Fredegund's bloodlust struck down churchmen and courtiers alike. One moment she could be charming, showering gifts. The next, she'd have a trusted advisor executed by night for suspected treachery. When Chilperic himself, her husband, was mysteriously stabbed to death in 584 while out riding, many suspected even Fredegund's own hand in that murder, for their marriage had grown strained. Indeed, Chilperic is remembered by one chronicler as the Nero and Herod of his times, a cruel king, but perhaps outdone in villainy by his even more ruthless queen. After Chilperic's death, Fredegund became regent for her infant son, Clothar II. Like a lioness, she defended his claim, eliminating rival Neustrian nobles and steadfastly contending with Brunhild's Austrasian line to ensure her boy would one day rule all Franks. Brunhild, for her part, was no saint either. She could be just as unyielding and vengeful. In Austrasia, she governed in the name of her son Childebert II, then her grandsons. She built roads, reformed coinage, and for a time brought stability. But she also executed nobles who defied her, earning their hatred. Her feud with Fredegund became a toxic obsession. As long as both women lived, the war between Austrasia and Neustria smoldered, flaring up in violence whenever chance allowed. The feud outlived Fredegund. Queen Fredegund died in 597, perhaps to the relief of many, of natural causes rather than violence. But even from the grave her influence lingered. Her son, Clothar II, grew up nurtured on his mother's bitter milk, taught to hate Brunhild for all the suffering between their families. By 613, after a bewildering sequence of events, the showdown reached its final act. Fredegund's son, King Clothar II of Neustria, now a grown man, moved to finish what his mother had started. Brunhild, then nearly 70 years old but still indomitable, attempted to keep power through her great-grandsons. The aging queen tried to install a boy, Sigebert II, on the Austrasian throne and rule through him. This proved a fatal mistake. The Austrasian nobility, weary of Brunhild's iron-fisted regency and frightened by the endless civil strife, defected. They made common cause with Clothar II. Together, the Neustrian king and the Austrasian nobles seized Brunhild and her remaining family. At last, the mighty Queen Brunhild fell into the hands of the son of her archenemy. Clothar II condemned her for the death of 10 Frankish kings. An exaggeration, perhaps, but she had seen off many in her lifetime indeed. The old queen did not go meekly. She is said to have cursed Clothar and hurled insults until the end. Clothar ensured her execution was spectacularly gruesome, a demonstration that the feud was conclusively over. Brunhild, Queen of Austrasia, last daughter of the Visigoths, was tied by ropes to the tails of wild horses and torn limb from limb when the beasts were set to charge. Her mangled remains were then burned to ashes, as if to wipe her from memory. So ended the 40-year war of the two queens, in a crescendo of savagery. Brunhild's tormented death was also the death knell of the old rivalry. In 613, King Clothar II reunited the Frankish kingdoms under one crown, fulfilling, ironically, what Brunhild's husband Sigebert had nearly done decades before. At last, the Frankish throne had one king again. Clothar II's victory, however, came at a price. The endless civil wars had weakened royal authority. In exchange for the support of various nobles and churchmen in toppling Brunhild, Clothar had to grant concessions. In 614, he issued the Edict of Paris, a charter of privileges for the aristocracy and church. It essentially formalized what years of chaos had wrought. Many powers of the king were devolved to regional counts and dukes. The great lords gained semi-autonomy in their lands. The church affirmed rights and lands. The Merovingian king, though triumphant, stood a little lower in practice, more first among equals and less the absolute ruler his grandfather Clovis had been. Still, the bloodletting was over. Clothar II reigned over a fragile peace until 628, and at his death left a stable succession to his son. That son was Dagobert I, and he would be remembered as the last great Merovingian king. After so much bloodshed and treachery, Dagobert's rule, 629 to 639, shines brightly, if briefly, as a golden age before the fall. He inherited a reunified realm and was determined to keep it together. One of his first acts was to eliminate potential rivals, brutally but efficiently. A half-brother, perhaps eyeing a share of the kingdom, was swiftly executed. Like his ancestor Clovis, Dagobert knew how to deal ruthlessly with threats. He then set about governing justly, at least by the standards of the 7th century. Dagobert I moved his capital to the old Gallo-Roman city of Paris, symbolically rooting his dynasty in the heart of the land. He maintained amicable relations with the church, patronized scholars and craftsmen, and was famed for his rich court. Frankish legend remembers good King Dagobert as a figure of both might and mirth. His treasure was vast, and he spent it on fine buildings and the church's glory. Notably, he founded the great abbey of Saint-Denis near Paris, destined to become the burial place of French kings. In that abbey's church, Dagobert would later be interred in regal style, the first of his line to be buried there, starting a tradition that lasted over 1,000 years. He also dispatched missions to make peace or war as needed. Under Dagobert, the Franks asserted influence as far as the Slavic lands in the east and the Basque territories in the south. For perhaps the last time, the Frankish king was truly king, not only in name but in action. Dagobert was not without cruelty. He reputedly had a rebellious Saxon leader's wife and children burned alive in front of him to force a surrender. Yet he was also praised for wise counsel and law-giving. His reign was that rare thing for the Merovingians, effective, respected, even admired. When Dagobert I died in 639, one chronicle sighed that it was the end of an era when justice existed. The judgment of hindsight sees Dagobert as the final Merovingian to exercise personal power over a united Frankish realm. After him, the decline set in irrevocably. Fate, and the Merovingians' own peculiar weaknesses, soon transformed kings into mere phantoms. Dagobert foolishly, or inevitably, repeated the pattern of dividing the kingdom among his heirs. His young sons Clovis II and Sigebert III inherited Neustria/Burgundy and Austrasia respectively, though as minors they could hardly rule. Real power in these kingdoms trickled down into the hands of mayors of the palace and regents, powerful nobles who managed royal affairs. A telling sign, as these boy kings grew, none displayed the energy or autonomy of their forebears. Sigebert III of Austrasia, for instance, was pious and gentle, so pious that later generations considered him a saint, but utterly ineffectual in statecraft. Clovis II in Neustria spent much of his short life enmeshed in pleasure or indolence. Some stories claim he fell into bouts of madness. In their name, the mayors of the palace wielded authority. Originally, the mayor, Latin major domus, master of the household, was like a chief steward for the royal estates, coordinating the king's servants and lands. But now, these mayors became something more, kingmakers and kingbreakers. They commanded armies, decided policy, and left the Rois fainéants, the do-nothing kings, as later French writers dubbed them, to sign decrees and perform ceremonies. One early attempt to actually replace the Merovingian bloodline ended in disaster. In 656, after Sigebert III died, the Austrasian mayor of the palace, Grimoald the Elder, dared a coup. Grimoald seized Sigebert's infant son, Dagobert II, and sent him off to a monastery with head shaved, the classic removal for a Merovingian. Then Grimoald put forth his own son, a boy named Childebert, known to history as Childebertus Adoptivus, proclaiming him king of Austrasia. For a short time, the illusion held. Grimoald's son sat on the throne he had no right to. But the reaction was swift and vicious. The other Frankish nobles and the Neustrian branch of the family were outraged at this presumptuous upstart daring to usurp sacred Merovingian blood. Grimoald was captured, dragged before a council, and executed in a grisly fashion, his body torn apart. His hapless son was disposed of as well, and the rightful Merovingian heir was eventually brought back. Dagobert II, now a teenager, returned from monastic exile to rule Austrasia for a time, only to be assassinated later, perhaps by some who still feared Grimoald's kin. The lesson was clear. The legend of the Merovingian royal blood still had teeth. In the 7th century, Men could hate a Merovingian king or fight him, but replacing him with a commoner was unthinkable. The people clung to the almost mystical principle that a Frankish king must come from Merovech's line, else he was no king at all. The long-haired monarchs, for all their feebleness, were still necessary symbols. Necessary, until they weren't. By the early 8th century, the reality on the ground had shifted so much that the symbol could finally be challenged. A new family had risen through the office of mayor of the palace, carefully, over generations. They were the Carolingians, though not yet called that, the descendants of a powerful Austrasian noble named Pepin of Landen and his son-in-law Arnulf of Metz. These two men had been part of the coalition that brought down Brunhild decades earlier. By backing Clothar II, they earned royal favor and high position. Their grandchildren and great-grandchildren entrenched themselves as hereditary mayors in Austrasia, amassing lands, wealth, and loyal followers. By 687, one of them emerged as the true strongman of all Francia, Pepin of Herstal, also known as Pepin II. In that year, at the Battle of Tertry, Pepin of Herstal, mayor of Austrasia, defeated the Neustrian forces and effectively took control of the entire Frankish realm. The king at the time, Theoderic III, became a puppet, if he wasn't one already. Pepin of Herstal humbly styled himself Dux et Princeps Francorum, Duke and Prince of the Franks, careful not to claim the kingly title, but wielding all the kingly power nonetheless. For the next 27 years, Pepin governed the Franks with a firm hand, establishing a de facto family dynasty of mayors. The Merovingian king was trotted out at assemblies and festivals, a robed figure with flowing hair sitting on a throne, and that was the extent of his role. All decisions, all leadership in war and peace, came from Pepin and his house. The chroniclers of later times would liken the Merovingians of the 8th century to idle kings sitting on the throne while the kingdom was ruled by the palace. It was as if the Merovingians had become slaves to their own sanctity, kept around because of the ancient reverence for their blood, but in truth imprisoned by it, allowed to do nothing of substance. They reigned, but they did not rule. Pepin of Herstal died in 714, and after a brief succession squabble, his illegitimate but immensely capable son Charles assumed the reins of power. This is the legendary Charles Martel, the Hammer of the Franks. Charles had to fight a civil war against rival Frankish nobles to secure his position, even putting another token Merovingian, Chilperic II, on the throne to appease certain factions. But secure it he did, through relentless military talent. It was under Charles Martel that the real power of the Frankish realm, military might, was fully harnessed by the mayor's family. Charles is most famous, of course, for the epic confrontation with an external foe, the Umayyad Caliphate's Muslim army advancing into Gaul from recently conquered Iberia. In 732, at the Battle of Tours, Poitiers, Charles Martel led a hardened Frankish host against the raiding forces of Emir Abdul-Rahman. The stakes were nothing less than the fate of Western Europe. In a fierce and bloody clash, Charles's infantry held the line against cavalry charges, and the Franks emerged victorious, the emir slain. Europe heaved a sigh of relief. Christendom had been defended. Charles's triumphant stand earned him immortal renown as the hammer of God's enemies. But interestingly, who was king when this happened? A Merovingian was technically on the throne. King Theoderic IV, a descendant of Dagobert, sat in a palace somewhere, perhaps playing with his long hair or stamping documents Charles prepared. Theoderic IV had zero to do with the salvation of his own kingdom. He may not even have been present anywhere near the battle. All glory went to Charles Martel. This was a telling moment. The Merovingian king had become irrelevant even in the kingdom's greatest victory. After Theoderic IV died in 737, Charles didn't even bother to appoint another king. Armed with this papal sanction, Pepin summoned the Frankish magnates. In an assembly at Soissons in 751, they formally deposed Childeric III. The last Merovingian was, in a ritual both symbolic and irreversible, shorn of his long hair. Imagine the scene. The aged Childeric, the last scion of Clovis, dragged before the gathering, scissors slicing through the sacred locks that had crowned his ancestors for centuries. With each snip, the power of legend evaporated. The old chronicles say Childeric's tears fell as his hair dropped to the floor. In that moment, he went from king to nothing, his magic gone, his lineage abruptly ended by a pair of shears. They clad him in a monk's robes and exiled him to a monastery, a living ghost to spend the rest of his days in quiet oblivion. The reign of the Merovingians was over. They had ruled the Franks for nearly 3 centuries, and now their final representative was locked away, his existence so negligible that even the date of his death would pass unrecorded. Pepin the Short, on the other hand, was raised on a shield, an ancient Frankish custom, and proclaimed king of the Franks with the acclamations of the nobles. The Pope's envoy anointed him with holy oil, the first time a Frankish king was ever formally anointed in the Old Testament style. This was crucial. It established that Pepin's kingship, and not the Merovingians, was sanctioned by God and Church. The holy oil that had once descended by miracle for Clovis was now symbolically poured on Pepin, transferring divine right to a new house. The Merovingian myth of sacred blood was replaced by a Christian right of kingship that would endure in Europe for 1,000 years. In 754, Pope Stephen II even traveled across the Alps to re-anoint Pepin and his sons, and granted Pepin the title Patrician of the Romans in gratitude for his pledge to defend the papacy. The Carolingian dynasty was born, and soon Pepin's son Charlemagne would expand the Frankish kingdom into an empire. The papacy's embrace had given Pepin the legitimacy the Merovingians once enjoyed from their bloodline. A new alliance of throne and altar was forged, leaving the old dynasty as a footnote. The Merovingian dynasty thus vanished from the stage. Yet, interestingly, it did not vanish from memory. The dramatic nature of their rise and fall ensured that they would not be forgotten. Indeed, the ghost of the Merovingians seemed to haunt subsequent rulers of France. Later Carolingians and even Capetian kings felt the need to draw connections to them. Myths and rumors persisted among common folk and in cloisters that maybe a Merovingian prince had survived somewhere, kept hidden, the rightful magic king who one day might return. This anxiety was not baseless. In the decades after Pepin's coup, there were occasional conspiracies where discontented nobles invoked the name of a Merovingian to rally support. The new Carolingian kings took no chances. Any Merovingian survivors, distant relations perhaps, were carefully watched or shuffled off to nunneries and monasteries. But it was in legend and esoteric lore that the Merovingians earned a second life, stranger and more enduring than Pepin could have imagined. If the official chronicles ended their story in 751, the unofficial stories were just beginning. Over the centuries, whispers grew that the Merovingians had not merely been kings, but keepers of a secret, that their bloodline was special in a way even they had not claimed. Some said they descended from ancient Trojans or the hero Alexander the Great through some unlikely lineage. Others kept returning to that original myth of Merovech's sea beast father, spinning new embellishments about how this gave the Merovingians occult knowledge or even non-human attributes. They were called the Sorcerer Kings because legends claimed they could heal by touch, tame beasts, or see the future. There were tales that they bore a birthmark, a cross shape over the heart, marking them as chosen by God. There were even stories that they had a secret immunity to poison or to death by water, a gift from their oceanic progenitor. Perhaps these are echoes of classical myths, like Achilles dipped in the Styx or Moses drawn from water. The Merovingian kings, in life often mediocre or powerless, became larger than life in folklore. Magician kings who slept with a sword and a wand under their pillow. Dagobert I, that last strong king, became a figure of legend to later medieval minds. Songs were sung of good King Dagobert, who would one day awaken from his tomb. And in more recent centuries, an even more provocative legend has taken shape, one that ties the Merovingians to the greatest story in Western religion. This is the myth of the Holy Grail bloodline. According to this legend, whispered by medieval heretics and resurrected by modern writers, The Merovingian dynasty's blood was sacred not because of a sea monster or mere Frankish bravado, but because they carried the blood of Jesus Christ himself. The story goes that after the crucifixion, Jesus' lineage continued, that he had a child, perhaps by Mary Magdalene, and that this bloodline survived, winding its way into the royal family of the Franks. In this telling, the Holy Grail, often depicted as a chalice, is not a cup at all, but a metaphor for a bloodline, the Sangreal, or Sang-Real, royal blood. The Grail was the womb of Magdalene carrying the blood of Christ, and the Merovingian kings, it is claimed, were the living Grail, the vessel of Jesus' descendants. Wild as it sounds, this idea caught the imagination of many. Secret societies in the shadows of history, from the Knights Templar in the Middle Ages to mystics in the Renaissance and beyond, were rumored to guard this secret and protect any remaining Merovingian heirs. The appeal of the myth is potent, that a dynasty unjustly deposed, shorn, and cast aside actually had the holiest pedigree of all, a pedigree that threatened the foundations of church authority and thus had to be suppressed. In modern times, popular books and novels have spread these ideas to a wide audience, spinning webs of conspiracy around the Merovingian name. According to these theories, the line of Merovech did not die. It flows through the veins of obscure French nobility even now, the last Sorcerer Kings biding their time. Is any of that true? Almost certainly not, at least in a literal sense. But the power of the Merovingian legend is real. It is a testament to how this dynasty, long after losing any temporal power, enthralled the collective imagination. They were remembered as the long-haired kings, tangible symbols of a lost era when kings might also have been cultic figures, straddling the border of the spiritual and the temporal. The long hair itself became a symbol of that ancient mystique. What other kings would be so defined by a physical trait? That hair, once a mark of charisma and legitimacy, proved to be the chains that bound them. By the end, a Merovingian's value lay only in being a Merovingian, being the legend, not acting in reality. They became prisoners of their own sacred image. The Carolingian usurpers understood this well. Pepin the Short needed the Pope's blessing to overturn the legend and to create a new one in its place. And when Pepin's grandson Charlemagne built an empire, he made sure to eclipse Merovingian memory by associating his line with biblical kings and Roman emperors instead. Over time, the Merovingians were reduced to half-forgotten phantoms, half history, half myth. So, how did a dynasty born in myth become enslaved by its own legends? In the Merovingian tale lies a profound lesson about the nature of power and belief. The Merovingians crafted an image of semi-divine kingship, whether intentionally or by the accident of stories like Merovech's birth, and they wrapped themselves in symbols: the uncut hair, the healing touch, the alliance with Holy Church, the very idea that their blood alone conferred kingship. These legends served them well when strong personalities like Clovis or Dagobert wielded them. A Merovingian king could rally warriors by claiming he was God's chosen, or frighten foes with rumors that he could not be killed except by magic. Myth was their armor. But over time, that armor became a gilded cage. Later Merovingians relied on their illustrious ancestry and hallowed aura to maintain power, even as they neglected the hard necessities of kingship, generalship, governance, the balancing of ambitious vassals. They took for granted that no one would dare break the sacred covenant of their bloodline. And for a while, no one did. Yet, ironically, by leaning so much on the idea of their sanctity, they became lazy in practice and let others, like the mayors of the palace, do the real ruling. The legend outgrew the men. The kings became ceremonial actors in a pageant while the mayors exercised muscle behind the curtains. Eventually, the people and the nobility realized that the emperor had no clothes, or rather, the king had nothing but his flowing hair and title. Pragmatic men like Charles Martel proved that victory in battle and leadership did not require Merovingian blood at all. The legend of divine blood, once cracked, shattered swiftly. The final act, the shaving of Childeric, was both literal and metaphorical. the cutting away of the illusion that had propped up a hollow crown. It was as if Samson himself, shorn of his locks, stood feeble and trembling where once a mighty hero had been. The thing that had made the Merovingians special, the mystique of their consecrated hair and ancient lineage, became the means of their dismissal. They were not dramatically slain on the battlefield as combatants for their throne. They were quietly tonsured and tucked away. Enslaved by legend, they had become too weak to fight for reality. In the end, the Merovingian dynasty leaves behind a paradoxical legacy. They were the founders of France, unwitting midwives of a nation. Clovis's baptism planted the cross in Western Europe's heart, shaping France and Germany's religious destiny. His Salic law and conquests laid the foundation for medieval France. The Merovingians patronized monasteries that preserved learning, and their very weaknesses led to the rise of a new order that would birth feudal Europe. Yet, their story also stands as a cautionary fable. Friedrich Nietzsche once warned that those who battle monsters must beware of becoming monsters themselves. In the Merovingians' case, those who wrap themselves in myth must beware becoming the slave of myth. Power can be as much illusion as steel. For the Merovingians, the illusion of their eternal sacred kingship became the monster that devoured them. They fought wars, made alliances, spilled the blood of kin and foe alike, all to strengthen their house. But in the end, faith in their inviolable blood lulled them into complacency, until a more vigorous hand snipped the golden thread of their lineage. So the treasure at the end of our hunt, the answer to our great question, is this: a dynasty born in legend perished by legend. The Merovingians created a mythic identity to justify absolute power. Over time, that myth became a trap, a set of expectations and rituals that sapped their vitality and invited challengers. They became relics in a world increasingly ruled by pragmatists. And when the final Merovingians' shorn hair fell to the floor, it was not just the end of a dynasty, but the birth of a new principle. That kingship could be transferred, even reinvented, if the story was compelling enough. In this case, the story of divine anointing from the Pope. The Sorcerer Kings had cast a spell over the Franks, but ultimately, they themselves fell under a spell, the belief that their crown was unassailable. In truth, no crown is unassailable. The bloodline that claimed to be Holy Grail was poured out and replaced with another vintage, leaving us to ponder how fragile the line between divine right and human ambition truly is. Thank you for joining Uncrowning on this epic journey through the rise and fall of the Merovingians, the Sorcerer Kings of the Franks. If you found this deep dive into myth and power illuminating, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you never miss a chapter of history's grand drama. Now, we'd love to know which dynasty or royal house you want us to unravel next. Perhaps the Medici, those merchant princes of Renaissance Italy? The Habsburgs, with their jaw-dropping empire and inbred intrigues? Or maybe the ancient Han Dynasty of China, shimmering with glory and tragedy? Let us know in the comments which saga you hunger for. Until next time, remember, the truth of history often lies not just in dates and battles, but in the legends we weave and unweave about those who wielded power. Keep seeking the story behind the story, and we'll see you in the next tale. Farewell.